In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a scream shatters the elegance of Willow Hall. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell, author of a scandalous memoir, lies dead, stabbed in a locked library. Who among the glittering guests, writer, doctor, actress, or widow, wielded the fatal letter opener? Why was her manuscript torn, its secrets stained with blood? As whispers of betrayal and hidden debts swirl, only Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom and keen eye, can unravel the deadly dance of motives. Will she expose the killer before another secret strikes? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Willow Hall, in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses and the church clock ticked with unhurried precision. Life moved at a pace that suited its residents. The village, nestled in the green heart of England, was a place where secrets were as carefully tended as the gardens, and where Miss Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and unassuming air, observed the world from her cottage window. It was a fine September morning in 1952, and the air carried a crispness that hinted at autumn's approach. At Willow Hall, the grandest house in the village, preparations were underway for an event that had set tongues wagging. A weekend house party hosted by the widowed Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell. Willow Hall, with its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows, stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead, a relic of Georgian elegance surrounded by manicured lawns and a sunken rose garden. Mrs. Cresswell, a woman of 50 with a penchant for ostentation, had recently returned to the village after years abroad, her fortune bolstered by a late husband's investments in South African mines. Her announcement of a literary salon to celebrate the publication of her memoir, A Life in Shadows, had drawn a curious assortment of guests. The village buzzed with speculation, for Mrs. Cresswell's past was rumoured to be as colourful as her garden's blooms. Miss Marple, knitting in her armchair by the window, had heard the gossip from her maid, Cherry Baker. "They say she's invited a famous writer, Miss Marple," Cherry had said, her eyes bright with excitement, "and a doctor, and some fancy London folk. There's even talk of an actress." Miss Marple had nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically. She knew well that such gatherings with their mix of egos and secrets often stirred trouble. She had declined the invitation to the party, citing a touch of rheumatism, but her interest was piqued. From her cottage, she could see the comings and goings at Willow Hall, and she noted the arrivals with quiet curiosity. The guests began to arrive on Friday afternoon, their cars crunching along the gravel drive. First came Mr. Julian Fairchild, a novelist whose detective stories had once rivaled those of Mrs. Christie herself. He was a lean man of 45, with sharp features and a habit of adjusting his spectacles as if perpetually surprised by the world. Next was Dr. Rupert Hayworth, a Harley Street physician whose brusque manner and heavy gold watch suggested both wealth and impatience. Miss Sylvia Dale, a young actress with golden curls and a laugh that carried across the lawn, arrived in a sleek convertible, accompanied by her manager, Mr. Leonard Voss, a wiry man with a nervous tic in his left eye. Then there was Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, a society widow with a penchant for emeralds and a voice that could cut glass, and her nephew, Mr. Colin Pritchard, a sullen young man who seemed ill at ease in his tailored suit. Finally, Miss Clara Henshaw, Mrs. Cresswell's spinster cousin, arrived on foot from the village, her pinched face betraying her resentment at being summoned. The household staff, too, were part of the tableau. Mrs. Marjorie Banks, the housekeeper, ruled the kitchen with a stern hand, while young Betty, the parlour maid, flitted about with wide-eyed curiosity. The butler, Mr. Ernest Gibbs, a man of impeccable decorum, moved silently through the house, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple, observing from her window, noted the tension in Betty's hurried steps and the way Gibbs paused to glance at the arriving guests. "People are so very revealing," she murmured to herself, "when they think no one is watching." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the guests gathered in the drawing-room for cocktails. Mrs. Cresswell, resplendent in a sapphire gown, held court with a glass of sherry, her memoir prominently displayed on a side table. "My book," she declared, "is a testament to truth. It spares no one, not even myself." Her words were met with polite smiles, but Miss Marple, had she been present, would have noticed the flicker of unease in Julian Fairchild's eyes, the tightening of Eleanor Pritchard's grip on her fan, and the way Sylvia Dale's laugh faltered. Dinner was a lavish affair, served in the oak-panelled dining-room. The menu, as Betty later recounted to Cherry, included consommé, roasted pheasant, and a lemon soufflé that had taken Mrs. Banks hours to perfect. The conversation, however, was less harmonious. Julian Fairchild spoke at length about the decline of modern literature, casting pointed glances at Mrs. Cresswell's memoir. Dr. Hayworth argued with Colin Pritchard over politics, their voices rising until Mrs. Cresswell intervened with a tinkling laugh. Sylvia Dale flirted shamelessly with Leonard Voss, who seemed more anxious than flattered, while Clara Henshaw sat in silence, her eyes darting from face to face. At precisely 9:47 p.m., as recorded by the dining-room clock, a scream pierced the air. It came from the library, where Mrs. Cresswell had retired to fetch a signed copy of her memoir for Sylvia. The guests rushed to the scene only to find Mrs. Cresswell slumped over her desk, a letter-opener buried in her back. Blood pooled on the blotter, staining the pages of her manuscript. Dr. Hayworth, ever the professional, knelt to check her pulse, but shook his head. "She's dead," he said grimly. "Murdered!" The room erupted in chaos. Sylvia Dale clutched Leonard Voss, sobbing, while Eleanor Pritchard demanded that someone call the police. Julian Fairchild stood frozen, his spectacles slipping down his nose, and Colin Pritchard muttered something about justice. Clara Henshaw, pale as a ghost, whispered, "She should never have written that book." Ernest Gibbs, the butler, restored order with a quiet command to Betty to fetch tea, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. The local constable, a young man named Pock, arrived within the hour, followed by Inspector Craddock from Scotland Yard, who had been visiting a nearby town. Craddock, a methodical man with a fondness for Miss Marple's insights, surveyed the scene with a frown. The library windows were locked from the inside, and the only door led to the hallway, where Gibbs had been stationed all evening. "A classic locked-room mystery," Craddock muttered, unaware that Miss Marple, informed by Cherry's breathless report, was already turning the matter over in her mind. The guests were ushered back to the drawing-room, where Craddock began his preliminary questions. Each claimed an alibi for the crucial moments between 9:30 and 9:47 p.m. Julian Fairchild said he had been in the billiard room, practicing shots alone. Dr. Hayworth claimed to have stepped outside for a cigarette on the terrace. Sylvia Dale and Leonard Voss insisted they had been together in the conservatory, discussing her next role. Eleanor Pritchard said she had been in her room, fetching a shawl, while Colin Pritchard claimed to have been in the garden, clearing his head. Clara Henshaw said she had been in the morning room, reading. Gibbs confirmed that he had seen no one enter or leave the library, though Betty mentioned a queer noise from the corridor at around 9:40. As the police cordoned off the library, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched. Cherry, bursting with news, recounted every detail. The letter opener, the locked windows, the blood-stained manuscript. Miss Marple listened, her pale blue eyes sharp. "A letter opener is such a personal weapon," she said softly, "and a memoir. That is a dangerous thing to write in a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone has something to hide." She recalled a similar incident years ago, when old Mrs. Hargreaves had threatened to reveal a neighbour's indiscretion, and found her prize roses poisoned. "People," Miss Marple mused, "are never so careful as they think." She resolved to visit Willow Hall the next morning, ostensibly to offer condolences. In truth, she knew that murder, like a badly knitted stitch, could be unravelled with patience and attention to detail. As the clock struck midnight, Willow Hall stood silent, its guests restless under the weight of suspicion. In her cottage, Miss Marple turned down her lamp, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the evening. A scream, a locked room, a manuscript, and a circle of strangers bound by secrets. The dance of motives had begun, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet wisdom, was ready to step into its rhythm. Chapter 2. The Shadow of the Crime. The morning after the murder at Willow Hall broke with a deceptive calm over St. Mary Mead. A thin mist clung to the meadows, and the church bells tolled 8 o'clock as Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl, made her way up the gravel path to the manor. Her step was steady, though she leaned lightly on her walking stick, a prop she used more for effect than necessity. In her basket, nestled among a few skeins of wool, was a condolence card for the household, but her true purpose was to observe. Murder, she knew, was like a stone dropped in a pond. Its ripples touched everyone, revealing truths in their distortions. At Willow Hall, the air was thick with unease. The police had cordoned off the library, where Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell's body had been removed under Inspector Craddock's supervision. The guests, confined to the house until further notice, lingered in the drawing room, their faces drawn and their voices hushed. Miss Marple was admitted by Betty, the parlour-maid, whose eyes were red from crying. "Oh, Miss Marple," Betty whispered, "it's awful. Mrs. Cresswell stabbed like that, and no one knows who did it." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. There, my dear. The truth has a way of coming to light, like a flower in spring." Inspector Craddock greeted Miss Marple with a respectful nod. He had worked with her before, and knew her unassuming demeanour hid a mind as sharp as a tack. "I'm glad you're here, Miss Marple," he said quietly, leading her to a corner of the hall. "This is a nasty business. Mrs. Cresswell was killed between 9:30 and 9:47 last night, stabbed with her own letter-opener. The library was locked, windows bolted, and the only door leads to the hallway, where Gibbs, the butler, swears he saw no one pass." Miss Marple tilted her head, her pale eyes thoughtful. "A locked room, you say? How very intriguing! And the letter-opener, such an intimate choice." Was it taken from the desk, do you think? Craddock nodded. It was hers, kept on the blotter. No fingerprints but her own, though the handle was wiped clean. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Wiped clean, she murmured. That suggests a careful mind, does it not? She declined Craddock's offer to view the crime scene, preferring to sit in the morning room with a cup of tea. From there, she could hear the murmur of voices and observe the guests as they drifted in and out. Julian Fairchild, the novelist, sat by the window, scribbling in a notebook, his spectacles glinting in the morning light. Dr. Rupert Hayworth paced the room, his gold watch chain swinging like a pendulum. Sylvia Dale, the actress, reclined on a chaise longue, her golden curls dishevelled, while Leonard Voss hovered nearby, his nervous tic more pronounced. Eleanor Pritchard, resplendent in a black silk dress, clutched a handkerchief, though her eyes were dry. Her nephew, Colin Pritchard, slouched in a chair, his sullen expression unchanged. Clara Henshaw, Mrs. Cresswell's cousin, sat knitting in a corner, her needles moving with a ferocity that belied her frail appearance. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes darting from face to face. She noted the way Julian Fairchild's pen paused when Sylvia laughed, the way Dr. Hayworth's pacing faltered when Eleanor spoke, and the way Clara's needles stilled when Colin shifted in his seat. People are so very careless, she thought, when they think they are unobserved. Craddock began his formal interviews in the dining room, and Miss Marple, with the inspector's permission, sat quietly in an adjoining alcove, her presence unnoticed by the suspects. First was Julian Fairchild, who repeated his alibi. He had been in the billiard room from 9:20 until the scream practicing shots alone. I heard nothing unusual, he said, adjusting his spectacles. Mrs. Cresswell's memoir was provocative, yes, but I had no quarrel with her. Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice when he mentioned the memoir. Dr. Hayworth was next, his manner brusque. He claimed to have been on the terrace, smoking from 9:25 to 9:50. I saw no one, heard nothing, he said. As for Lavinia's book, I hadn't read it. Her life was her own affair. But Miss Marple caught the flicker of his eyes toward the library door, as if he feared what it might reveal. Sylvia Dale and Leonard Voss were interviewed together, at Sylvia's insistence. We were in the conservatory, Sylvia said, her voice trembling with theatrical flair. Discussing my career, weren't we, Lenny? Voss nodded vigorously, his tic betraying his nerve. Yes, from 9:15 onward. We didn't hear the scream until we returned to the drawing room. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The conservatory was at the far end of the house, yet Sylvia's dress bore a faint smudge of rose pollen, suggesting a visit to the garden. Eleanor Pritchard claimed she had gone upstairs at 9:30 to fetch a shawl, returning just before the scream. I was alone, she said coolly. Lavinia's memoir was vulgar, but I had no reason to harm her. Her nephew, Colin, was less composed, muttering that he had been in the garden, walking off dinner. He admitted to disliking his aunt's friend, saying she was always stirring trouble. Miss Marple noted the grass stains on his shoes, unusually heavy for a casual stroll. Clara Henshaw, the last to be interviewed, was tight-lipped. I was reading in the morning room, she said. Lavinia's book was a mistake. She thought she could expose us all and walk away unscathed. Her voice held a bitterness that made Miss Marple's fingers pause on her teacup. The staff were questioned next. Ernest Gibbs, the butler, reiterated that he had been in the hallway, overseeing the serving of coffee. No one entered the library, he said firmly. Betty, the parlour maid, was less certain. I heard a noise, like a thud, around 9:40, she said, twisting her apron, but I was in the pantry, so I can't be sure. Mrs. Marjorie Banks, the housekeeper, claimed to have been in the kitchen all evening, preparing the next day's menu. Mrs. Cresswell was a demanding mistress, she said, her lips thin, but I did my duty. As the interviews concluded, Miss Marple strolled through the rose garden, ostensibly to admire the blooms. She paused by a bed of crimson roses, noting a broken stem and a scattering of petals on the path. How curious, she murmured, bending to examine the ground. A small, glinting object caught her eye. A cufflink, engraved with the letter P. She tucked it into her basket, her expression serene. Back in the morning room, she overheard a snatch of conversation between Sylvia and Voss. "You mustn't say anything, Lenny," Sylvia hissed. "It's our secret." Voss's reply was inaudible, but his tick was frantic. Miss Marple's mind turned to a similar case in St. Mary Mead, when a young couple's whispered confidences had masked a deeper deceit. Secrets, she thought, are like weeds. They grow best in the dark. Inspector Craddock joined her for tea, his notebook filled with alibis and contradictions. "It's a puzzle, Miss Marple," he said. "The library was locked, the weapon was wiped, and everyone claims to have been elsewhere. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is early yet, Inspector, but I find that people's alibis, like their gardens, often have gaps. Tell me, was anything taken from the library?" Craddock frowned. The memoir was open on the desk, blood-stained but intact. A few pages were torn, but nothing seems missing. Miss Marple nodded. "And the letter opener? Was it placed in her hand, or did she grasp it before she fell?" Craddock's eyes widened. "It was in her back, driven deep. No chance she held it." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Then we must ask why someone chose such a weapon, and why they wished to leave no trace." As the afternoon waned, the guests retired to their rooms, their alibis hanging like fragile threads. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind weaving a pattern from the morning's observations. The cufflink, the rose pollen, the torn pages, the thud Betty heard. Murder, she reflected, is never a simple act. It is a story, and every story has its clues. In Willow Hall, the shadows lengthened, and the guests avoided each other's eyes. The crime had cast a net, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was already tugging at its edges. Chapter 3. Miss Marple's Quiet Arrival. By Saturday afternoon, Willow Hall seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell's murder pressing down on its inhabitants like a storm cloud over St. Mary Mead. The police presence had intensified, with Inspector Craddock and his men combing the house for further evidence, while the guests confined to the premises moved restlessly between the drawing-room and their private quarters. Miss Jane Marple, however, was not one to be deterred by tension. She returned to the manor at precisely 2:15 p.m., her basket swinging lightly on her arm, her eyes as bright and observant as ever. Ostensibly, she had come to offer further condolences and to inquire after Clara Henshaw, who she recalled as a distant acquaintance from a long-ago village fete. In truth, she intended to let the house and its occupants speak to her in their unguarded moments. The hall was quieter now. The initial shock of the murder giving way to a strained politeness. Betty, the parlour-maid, admitted Miss Marple with a nervous curtsy, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's good of you to come, miss," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "Everyone's so on edge, and the police keep asking questions." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It must be very trying, my dear, but a cup of tea and a quiet chat can do wonders, don't you think?" Betty nodded, leading her to the morning room, where Clara Henshaw sat alone, her knitting abandoned on the table. Clara looked up, her pinched face softening slightly at the sight of Miss Marple. "Jane," she said, her voice brittle, "I didn't expect you. This dreadful business." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her movements deliberate. "Dreadful indeed, Clara. I thought of you alone here among strangers. How are you bearing up?" Clara's lips tightened. "Lavinia was my cousin, but we were never close. Her book, her wretched book, stirred up things best left buried. I warned her, you know." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest, but she merely nodded, encouraging Clara to continue. "She thought she could write about everyone's secrets and call it literature," Clara said bitterly. "Now look what's happened." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew out her knitting, a pale blue scarf taking shape. "Secrets are dangerous things," she said mildly. "In my experience, they have a way of demanding to be heard. Tell me, Clara, who was most upset by Lavinia's memoir?" Clara hesitated, then shrugged. "All of them, I suppose. Julian Fairchild thought it mocked his work. Dr. Haworth was furious about some medical scandal she hinted at. Sylvia Dale, well, actresses are sensitive about their reputations, and Eleanor Pritchard. Lavinia knew things about her late husband that Eleanor didn't want aired." Miss Marple nodded, filing away each name. "And young Colin? Or Mr. Voss?" Clara's needles resumed their rhythm, faster now. "Colin's a sullen boy, always resentful. As for Voss, he's a nervous sort. Lavinia said he'd been involved in something shady in London." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, who greeted Miss Marple with a wry smile. "You've a knack for turning up, Miss Marple," he said. "Care to share any observations?" She smiled demurely. "Only that people are rarely as composed as they seem, Inspector. Have you examined the manuscript itself? The torn pages, perhaps?" Craddock's brow furrowed. "We've sent it to the lab, but it's a mess, blood-stained, pages ripped. Looks like someone tried to destroy it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Or to find something specific," she suggested. Craddock invited her to join him in the drawing-room, where the guests were gathered for further questioning. Miss Marple settled into a corner, her knitting a shield for her scrutiny. Julian Fairchild was recounting his movements again, insisting he'd been alone in the billiard room. "I'm a writer, Inspector," he said testily. "I don't need company to amuse myself." Dr. Haworth, still pacing, claimed his terrace cigarette had kept him clear of the library. Sylvia Dale, her voice tremulous, clung to Voss's arm, repeating their conservatory alibi. Eleanor Pritchard sat erect, her emeralds glinting, and dismissed any suggestion that she'd been near the library. Colin Pritchard muttered about the garden, his eyes avoiding his aunt's. Clara, now rejoined by Miss Marple, said little, her fingers clutching her knitting. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to small details. The way Julian's spectacles were smudged, suggesting he'd handled them nervously. The faint scent of tobacco on Dr. Haworth's coat, stronger than a single cigarette might leave. the rose pollen still clinging to Sylvia's sleeve, unnoticed by the actress herself. She noted, too, Colin's grass-stained shoes, which seemed oddly worn on the heels, and the way Voss's tic worsened when Craddock mentioned the memoir's contents. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple excused herself to take a turn about the house, accompanied by Betty, who was eager to escape the drawing-room's tension. In the hallway, Miss Marple paused by the library door, still sealed with police tape. "Tell me, Betty," she said, "that thud you heard at 9:40. Where exactly were you?" Betty blushed. "In the pantry, miss, just off the corridor. I was sneaking a biscuit. I heard it through the wall, like something heavy falling." Miss Marple nodded, her mind picturing the layout of Willow Hall. The pantry was near the service stairs which led to the upper floors. "And did you see anyone in the corridor afterward?" Betty shook her head. "Only Mr. Gibbs, miss, but he was at his post by the dining room." They continued to the rose garden, where Miss Marple bent to examine the broken stem she'd noticed the previous day. The scattered petals were gone, likely swept away by the gardener, but she found another clue. A single thread of green wool, caught on a thorn. "How curious," she murmured, tucking it into her basket beside the cufflink. She recalled a cardigan Clara had worn at dinner, a shade of green that matched the thread. People leave traces, she thought, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Back in the morning room, Miss Marple overheard a heated exchange between Eleanor Pritchard and her nephew. "You mustn't be so careless, Colin," Eleanor snapped. "What you did last night, people notice." Colin's reply was sullen. "I didn't do anything, Aunt Eleanor. You're the one who hated her." Miss Marple's needles paused. Hatred, she knew, was a powerful motive, but so was fear. Inspector Craddock joined her later, looking weary. "The alibis are holding, but they're shaky," he said. "Gibbs swears no one passed him, but Betty's thud suggests something happened nearby. And the memoir? Lab says the torn pages were from a chapter about London society in the 30s. Could be a clue to motive." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Inspector. A memoir is a mirror, and not everyone likes what they see reflected. Have you considered the timing? 9:30 to 9:47 is a narrow window, yet someone moved swiftly and silently." As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind a tapestry of clues. The cufflink with a P, the green thread, the rose pollen, the thud at 9:40, the torn pages. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a stolen letter had led to a confrontation in a locked room. The simplest explanation, she mused, is often the most overlooked, but we must be patient. The truth, like a good tea, needs time to steep. At Willow Hall, the guests dined in silence, their alibis fraying under Craddock's relentless questions. Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, turned down her lamp, her thoughts circling the locked library and the secrets it held. The dance of motives was growing clearer, and she was ready to follow its next step. Chapter 4. The Questions Deepen. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead on Sunday morning, casting long shadows across the lawns of Willow Hall. The village, usually alive with the hum of weekend activity, seemed subdued, as if the murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had draped a veil over its usual cheer. Inside the manor, the atmosphere was taut, the guests moving like chess pieces under the watchful eye of Inspector Craddock and his men. Miss Jane Marple, however, arrived at precisely 10:30 a.m., her basket brimming with fresh scones as a pretext for her visit. Her true purpose was to probe deeper into the web of alibis and motives, her gentle demeanour masking the precision of her observations. Betty, the parlour maid, greeted her at the door, her face pale but eager to talk. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's been dreadful," she whispered, glancing toward the drawing-room where the guests were gathered. "Everyone's snapping at each other, and the police keep poking about. I don't know how much more we can take." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Courage, my dear. The truth is like a tangled skein of wool. Patience will unravel it." She handed Betty the scones and made her way to the morning room, where Inspector Craddock was reviewing his notes. Craddock looked up, his expression a mix of frustration and relief. "Miss Marple, you're a sight for sore eyes," he said. "This case is a maze. The alibis are flimsy, but they're holding just. We've got the lab report on the memoir. The torn pages were from a chapter titled London Shadows, detailing Mrs. Cresswell's time in high society. It mentions names, scandals, even a hushed-up court case. Could be motive for any of them." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "A memoir that names names is a dangerous thing, Inspector. Like a pebble in a shoe, it irritates until something is done. Have you spoken to the staff again?" Craddock sighed. "Gibbs sticks to his story. No one passed him in the hallway. Mrs. Banks was in the kitchen, and Betty's thud at 9:40 is our only lead to something odd. I'm starting to think the killer slipped through a crack we haven't found." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Or perhaps, Inspector, they didn't need to slip at all. A locked room is only a puzzle if you assume the door is the only way in or out." She settled into a chair by the window, her knitting resuming its rhythmic click. From her vantage point, she could see the guests in the drawing-room, their interactions revealing more than their words. Julian Fairchild, the novelist, was writing furiously in his notebook, but his glances towards Sylvia Dale were frequent and uneasy. Dr. Rupert Hayworth stood by the fireplace, his gold watch chain catching the light as he argued with Eleanor Pritchard about the police's progress. Sylvia, her golden curls pinned haphazardly, was whispering to Leonard Voss, whose nervous tick seemed to pulse with every word. Colin Pritchard slouched in a corner, his sullen gaze fixed on his aunt, while Clara Henshaw, knitting in a nearby chair, watched them all with a tight-lipped intensity. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a small detail, a faint scratch on Julian's hand, barely visible as he adjusted his spectacles. She recalled a similar mark on a village boy who'd once climbed through a thorny hedge to steal apples. Thorns leave such distinctive traces, she thought, her mind returning to the green thread she'd found in the rose garden. She also noted the way Sylvia's dress, a different one today, still bore a trace of rose pollen on the hem, as if she'd brushed against the same blooms again. Craddock began his second round of interviews, and Miss Marple, with his tacit approval, remained in the morning room, close enough to overhear. Julian Fairchild was first, his tone defensive. "I've told you, Inspector, I was in the billiard room. Mrs. Cresswell's memoir was inflammatory, yes, but I had no reason to kill her. She was no threat to me." Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in his voice, as if he were convincing himself as much as Craddock. Dr. Hayworth followed, his impatience palpable. "I was on the terrace, as I said. I didn't read her blasted book, but I heard it mentioned a malpractice suit from years ago. Nothing to do with me, of course." His fingers brushed his watch chain, and Miss Marple noticed a faint stain on his cuff, perhaps tobacco or something darker. Sylvia Dale and Leonard Voss repeated their conservatory alibi, but Sylvia's voice cracked when asked about the memoir. "Lavinia was cruel," she said softly. "She wrote things about my past, things I'd rather forget." Voss nodded, his tic betraying his anxiety. "We were together, Inspector. We didn't hear a thing." Eleanor Pritchard was composed, her emeralds glinting as she spoke. "I was in my room fetching a shawl. Lavinia's memoir was tasteless, but I had no cause to harm her. My late husband's name was dragged through it, but he's beyond caring." Colin Pritchard, questioned next, was less restrained. "She was a meddler," he spat, "always poking into our lives. I was in the garden, and I didn't see her." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his shoes, still grass-stained, the heels worn in a way that suggested more than a casual walk. Clara Henshaw was the last guest questioned. "I was reading," she said curtly. "Lavinia's book was a betrayal. She wrote about my family, things she had no right to share." Her hands gripped her knitting, and Miss Marple noted the green cardigan folded on the chair beside her, its shade matching the thread from the garden. The staff were called next. Ernest Gibbs, the butler, maintained his impeccable calm. "I was in the hallway, sir. No one entered the library while I was there." Betty, still nervous, repeated her story of the thud at 9:40. "I didn't see anything, sir. Honest. Just heard that noise, like a book falling." Mrs. Banks, the housekeeper, was brisk. "I was in the kitchen preparing for breakfast. Mrs. Cresswell was difficult, but I had no quarrel with her." Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered Betty's thud. A book, perhaps, or something heavier, dropped in haste. After the interviews, Miss Marple took a turn through the house, accompanied by Betty, who was eager to escape the tension. They paused by the service stairs, a narrow passage leading to the upper floors. Miss Marple noted a scuff mark on the wall, barely noticeable, at about knee-height. "How curious," she said, bending to examine it. The mark was fresh, and a tiny fleck of green paint clung to it, matching the hallway's trim. "Someone was in a hurry," she murmured, her mind picturing the layout of Willow Hall. The service stairs led to a landing near the library's rear wall, where a small window, often overlooked, was set high above the rose garden. In the garden, Miss Marple examined the rose bed again. The broken stem was still there, and she found another petal, crushed into the soil as if stepped on. Nearby, a faint indentation in the grass suggested a ladder or some heavy object had rested there briefly. "People are so careless," she thought, adding the observation to her mental tapestry. The cufflink, the green thread, the rose pollen, the thud, the scuff mark, the indentation. Back in the morning room, she overheard a tense exchange between Sylvia and Voss. "You promised to keep quiet, Lenny," Sylvia whispered, her voice sharp. "If they find out, we're done for." Voss's reply was a mumble, but his tic was relentless. Miss Marple's mind drifted to a village scandal years ago, when a young woman's secret affair had led to a confrontation in a locked shed. Secrets bind people, she thought, but they also break them. Craddock joined her for tea, his notebook brimming with contradictions. "The alibis don't add up, Miss Marple," he said. "Someone's lying, but I can't pin it down. The memoir's the key, I think. Those torn pages point to someone desperate to hide something. Miss Marple nodded. Desperation, Inspector, is a powerful force, but so is opportunity. Have you checked the library window? The one above the garden? Craddock's eyes widened. It's too high, surely, but I'll have it examined. As dusk settled over Willow Hall, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The cufflink with a P, the green thread, the rose pollen, the thud at 9:40, the scuff mark, the indentation. Murder, she mused, is like a village dance. Everyone knows the steps, but someone always stumbles. In the manor, the guests dined in silence, their secrets simmering like a pot about to boil over. Miss Marple turned down her lamp, ready to let the next day's observations guide her closer to the truth. Chapter 5. The red herrings emerge. The third day at Willow Hall dawned with a heavy sky, the clouds over St. Mary Mead threatening rain. The murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had cast a pall over the village, and the manor's inhabitants moved with the wariness of those who know suspicion follows their every step. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 11 a.m., her basket containing a jar of homemade damson jam as a pretext for her visit. Her true purpose was to sift through the growing tangle of clues and alibis, her quiet presence a beacon of calm amid the storm of distrust. She knew that in a murder case, the truth often hid behind the loudest distractions, and she was determined to spot the red herrings before they led the investigation astray. Inspector Craddock met her in the hall, his face etched with frustration. "Miss Marple, we've hit a wall," he admitted, leading her to the morning room. "The library window you mentioned, it's high, but we found scuff marks on the sill, as if someone climbed through. Problem is, it's a 10-foot drop to the garden, and there's no sign of a ladder. The rosebed below has that indentation you noticed, but it's inconclusive." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes bright. "A window is a door to those bold enough, Inspector, and boldness often comes with desperation. Have you learned more about the memoir's torn pages?" Craddock produced a typed report from the lab. The missing pages detailed a 1930s scandal involving a rigged horse race and a doctor's misdiagnosis that led to a death. Names were redacted, but it's clear Mrs. Cresswell was pointing fingers at someone in this house. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she considered this. "A scandal from the past," she murmured, "is like an old wound. It festers until it's exposed." In the drawing room, the guests were restless, their polite facades fraying. Julian Fairchild, the novelist, was arguing with Dr. Rupert Haworth over the merits of Mrs. Cresswell's memoir. "It was sensationalist drivel," Julian snapped, his spectacles slipping. "She had no right to drag up old gossip." Haworth's face reddened. "And you think your detective novels are high art? She mocked my profession too, but I didn't kill her." Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting, noted the scratch on Julian's hand, now scabbed, and the way Haworth's fingers twitched toward his watch chain. Sylvia Dale, the actress, was the centre of attention, her golden curls trembling as she recounted a tearful version of her alibi to Constable Polk. "Lenny and I were in the conservatory, I swear," she said, clutching Leonard Voss's arm. Voss nodded, his tic more pronounced under Polk's scrutiny. "We didn't hear anything until the scream," he muttered. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on Sylvia's dress, where a fresh smudge of rose pollen suggested another visit to the garden. She recalled a village girl who'd once lied about her whereabouts, her muddy shoes betraying her. Eleanor Pritchard sat apart, her emeralds catching the light as she fanned herself. "This is intolerable," she told Craddock. "I was in my room, as I said. Lavinia's death is tragic, but I had no part in it." Her nephew, Colin Pritchard, was less composed, his sullen demeanour giving way to agitation. "Why do you keep asking me about the garden?" he demanded. "I was there, walking. I didn't see her." Miss Marple noted the worn heels of his shoes, suggesting more than a casual stroll, and the way his eyes darted toward his aunt. Clara Henshaw, knitting furiously in a corner, avoided Craddock's questions. "I was reading," she repeated. "Lavinia's book was a betrayal, but I didn't harm her." Miss Marple's gaze fell on Clara's green cardigan, draped over her chair, its shade an exact match for the thread from the rose garden. "People cling to their habits," she thought, "even when they're careless." The investigation took a turn when Constable Polk announced a discovery. A blood-stained handkerchief, found in the shrubbery near the rose garden. It bore the initials J.F. Julian Fairchild's. The room fell silent as Craddock confronted the novelist. "Care to explain this, Mr. Fairchild?" Julian paled, his spectacles slipping further. I lost a handkerchief that evening. I must have dropped it in the garden earlier. I wasn't near the library." His voice rose, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands shook, the scratch on one standing out starkly. The handkerchief galvanized the police, and suspicion fell heavily on Julian. Dr. Hayworth seized the moment, pointing out that Julian had been vocal about his dislike for Mrs. Cresswell's memoir. "He called it a slander on his craft," Hayworth said, his tone accusatory. Sylvia nodded tearfully, adding, "He was so angry at dinner." Julian protested, but the room's mood shifted, the guests eyeing him with newfound wariness. Miss Marple, however, remained unconvinced. "A handkerchief is a convenient clue," she thought, recalling a village theft where a dropped glove had been planted to mislead. She took a quiet walk through the house with Betty, who was eager to share gossip. "Mr. Fairchild's in trouble now, miss," Betty said. "But I saw Mr. Voss sneaking about the corridor that night, near the service stairs. He looked ever so jumpy." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the scuff mark on the stairs wall. "And did you see anyone else, Betty?" The maid hesitated. "Well, Mrs. Pritchard was upstairs, but I thought I heard her door creak just before the scream. I didn't say, 'cause I wasn't sure." Miss Marple smiled. "You've done well to remember, my dear." In the rose garden, Miss Marple examined the indentation again. It was deeper than she'd first thought, suggesting something heavy, a ladder perhaps or a crate, had been placed and removed. Nearby, she found a tiny shard of glass, glinting in the grass. It was curved, like part of a spectacle lens. "How very careless," she murmured, adding it to her basket beside the cufflink and green thread. She pictured the library window, high but not unreachable with effort, and the rose bed below, trampled by someone in haste. Back in the morning room, she overheard a tense exchange between Eleanor and Colin. "You must keep your temper, Colin," Eleanor hissed. "They're watching us." Colin's reply was bitter. "You're the one who wanted her silenced, Aunt Eleanor." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind weaving the words into her tapestry of clues. The cufflink with a P, the green thread, the rose pollen, the thud at 9:40, the scuff mark, the indentation, the glass shard. Craddock joined her, his expression grim. "Fairchild's handkerchief is damning, but it feels too neat," he said. "I've sent men to check the library window again. If someone climbed through, they'd need a way to reach it." Miss Marple nodded. "And they'd need a reason to risk it, Inspector. Have you considered the staff? Gibbs, for instance. His post in the hallway is convenient, but it doesn't mean he stayed there." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think the butler did it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, Inspector, that everyone has a story, and not all of them are true." As the afternoon waned, the guests grew more fractious. Julian Fairchild's protests drowned out by accusations. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind a whirl of details. The handkerchief, the glass shard, Voss's furtive movements, Eleanor's creaking door. She recalled a village quarrel where a planted clue had nearly ruined an innocent man. "Red herrings," she mused, "are the murderer's favourite bait, but they cannot hide forever." At Willow Hall, the police tightened their focus on Julian, while the other guests exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple turned down her lamp, her thoughts circling the locked library and the secrets it guarded. The dance of motives was quickening, and she was ready to follow its next turn. Chapter 6. A Clue in the Details. By Monday morning, the air in St. Mary Mead carried a damp chill, as if the village itself mourned the unresolved tragedy at Willow Hall. The murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had woven a net of suspicion around the manor's guests, and the police, led by Inspector Craddock, were no closer to untangling it. Miss Jane Marple arrived at the hall at 10 a.m., her basket now holding a small bouquet of late roses, a gesture of condolence that masked her intent to probe deeper into the web of clues. She knew that in a murder case, the smallest details, a gesture, a word, a misplaced object, could illuminate the truth, and she was determined to find the thread that would unravel the mystery. The manor was quieter now, the initial shock giving way to a brittle tension. Betty, the parlour maid, admitted Miss Marple with a nervous smile. "It's awful, miss," she whispered. "Mr. Fairchild's in a state, what with that handkerchief, and everyone's pointing fingers." Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes gentle but sharp. "People often point to hide their own shadows, Betty. Tell me, have you noticed anything else odd since Friday?" Betty hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, miss, I saw Mr. Voss with a book from the library yesterday, one of Mrs. Cresswell's. He hid it quick when he saw me." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "A book, you say? How very interesting." In the morning room, Inspector Craddock greeted her, his notebook brimming with contradictions. "Miss Marple, that window lead paid off," he said, his voice low. "We found a rope tied to a tree in the rose garden, hidden in the foliage. It's short, but it could have reached the library window with a boost, say, a crate or ladder. Trouble is, no one saw anything, and Gibbs swears the hallway was clear." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "A rope suggests planning, Inspector, and planning suggests someone who knew the house well. Have you questioned the staff about their movements before dinner?" Craddock frowned. "Gibbs and Mrs. Banks claim they were busy with preparations. Betty was in the pantry as she said. But that thud at 9:40, it's nagging at me. It could be the key." Miss Marple nodded. "A sound can be as revealing as a footprint, Inspector. And what of the glass shard I mentioned? Any matches?" Craddock shook his head. "Not yet, but we're checking. It could be from a spectacle lens, as you suggested, or something else entirely. Miss Marple settled by the window, her knitting a shield for her observations. In the drawing-room, the guests were restless, their alibis fraying under scrutiny. Julian Fairchild, still shaken by the handkerchief's discovery, was defending himself to Dr. Rupert Haworth. "I lost it in the garden days ago," Julian insisted, his spectacles smudged. Haworth scoffed, his gold watch chain glinting. "Convenient, Fairchild. You hated her book as much as anyone." Miss Marple noted the scratch on Julian's hand, now healing, and the way Haworth's cuff bore that same faint stain, possibly ink or blood. Sylvia Dale, her golden curls pinned tightly, was whispering to Leonard Voss in a corner. "We can't let them find out, Lenny," she hissed, her voice barely audible. Voss's tick was relentless, his eyes darting toward the door. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Sylvia's shoes, which bore a fresh trace of garden soil, and Voss's jacket, where a button hung loose, its thread green and familiar. She recalled the green thread from the rose garden, a match for Clara's cardigan, but now possibly linked to Voss. Eleanor Pritchard sat erect, her emeralds catching the light as she spoke to Craddock. "I've told you, Inspector. I was in my room. This obsession with Julian is absurd. Lavinia had enemies everywhere." Her nephew, Colin Pritchard, was less composed, his sullen demeanour cracking. "Why don't you ask Aunt Eleanor about her husband's debts?" he snapped, earning a sharp look from her. Miss Marple noted Colin's grass-stained shoes, the heels still oddly worn, and the way Eleanor's fan snapped shut at his words. Clara Henshaw, knitting in her usual corner, was silent but watchful. Lavinia's memoir was a poison pen, she told Craddock when pressed. "She wrote about my family's ruin, things she swore to keep secret." Miss Marple's eyes rested on Clara's green cardigan, now worn, its sleeve slightly frayed where a thorn might have caught it. Craddock's interviews continued, and Miss Marple listened from her alcove, her knitting a steady rhythm. Julian repeated his billiard-room alibi, but his voice faltered when asked about the Gioi handkerchief. "I don't know how it got there," he said, his hands trembling. Haworth's terrace alibi held, but he admitted to reading parts of the memoir before dinner. "It was nonsense," he said, "but it mentioned a doctor's error I'd rather not discuss." Sylvia and Voss clung to their conservatory story, but Sylvia's eyes filled with tears when Craddock mentioned the memoir's hints at her past. "It was cruel," she whispered. Voss nodded, his tic betraying his nerves. Eleanor Pritchard maintained her composure, but Colin's outburst about her husband's debts drew a gasp from the room. "You ungrateful boy," she hissed, her fan trembling. Colin's garden alibi was vague, and Miss Marple noted his fidgeting hands, one missing a cufflink. Clara's reading alibi was unshaken, but her bitterness toward Lavinia was palpable. "She deserved to lose something," Clara muttered, her needles flashing. The staff were questioned again. Ernest Gibbs, the butler, was adamant. "I never left the hallway, sir. No one passed me." Betty repeated her story of the thud, adding, "It was like a book, but heavier, maybe a box." Mrs. Banks, the housekeeper, was curt. "I was in the kitchen. Mrs. Cresswell's demands kept me busy." Miss Marple's mind lingered on Gibbs's impeccable calm, wondering if it masked something deeper. After the interviews, Miss Marple strolled through the house with Betty, pausing by the service stairs. The scuff mark was still there, and she noticed a faint smudge of grease on the banister, as if someone had gripped it in haste. "Betty," she asked, "did you clean these stairs recently?" Betty shook her head. "Not since Thursday, miss." Mrs. Banks had me polishing silver all day Friday. Miss Marple nodded, adding the grease smudge to her mental list. The cufflink with a P, the green thread, the rose pollen, the thud at 9:40, the scuff mark, the indentation, the glass shard. In the rose garden, she examined the rope Craddock had mentioned. It was coarse, the kind used for gardening, and its end was frayed, as if cut hastily. Nearby, she found a tiny scrap of paper, caught in a rose bush. It was torn, with a single word visible: debt. Miss Marple tucked it into her basket, her mind turning to the memoir's torn pages. A debt, she thought, is a chain that binds more than one person. Back in the morning room, she overheard Colin muttering to himself, "She knew too much, and now look." Eleanor's sharp voice cut in. "Be quiet, Colin. You'll ruin us." Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts drifting to a village scandal where a whispered debt had led to betrayal. Money, she mused, is as old a motive as love. Craddock joined her, his expression weary. "The handkerchief points to Fairchild, but it's too obvious," he said. "The rope suggests someone climbed, but who? And why wipe the letter opener clean?" Miss Marple smiled, faintly. "A clean weapon is a silent one, Inspector. It speaks of someone who feared being seen. Have you checked the library's bookshelves? A heavy book, or box, might explain Betty's thud." Craddock's eyes lit up. "I'll have them searched." As evening fell, the guests dined in strange silence, Julian's handkerchief looming over the table like a spectre. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The cufflink, the thread, the pollen, the thud, the scuff, the indentation, the glass, the paper scrap. Details, she thought, are the stitches of truth. Pull one, and the whole fabric unravels. At Willow Hall, the shadows deepened, and the dance of motives grew more intricate. But Miss Marple was ready for its next step. Chapter 7. Lies and Hidden Truths. The fourth day at Willow Hall brought a restless energy to Saint. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sensed the undercurrents of deceit swirling within the manor's walls. The murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had tightened its grip on the guests, their alibis fraying like old lace under Inspector Craddock's relentless scrutiny. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 10:15 a.m., her basket now holding a small tin of biscuits, a gesture of neighbourly kindness that belied her purpose, to probe the lies surfacing among the suspects. She knew that murder, like a poorly kept garden, revealed its secrets through the weeds of inconsistency, and she was ready to pluck them one by one. Betty, the parlour maid, greeted her with a trembling smile, her eyes darting toward the drawing room where the guests were gathered. "It's worse today, Miss Marple," she whispered. "They're all at each other's throats, and Mr. Fairchild's near to breaking." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Fear makes people careless, Betty. Tell me, have you seen that book Mr. Voss was holding again?" Betty shook her head. "No, miss, but I saw him slip something into his pocket this morning. Looks like papers, maybe from the library." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Papers, you say? How very curious." In the morning room, Inspector Craddock met her, his face lined with exhaustion. "Miss Marple, we've found something," he said, holding up a heavy brass box, its lid engraved with a rose. "It was hidden behind a shelf in the library, just as you suggested. It's locked, but it's heavy. Could be what caused Betty's thud at 9:40. Miss Marple tilted her head, examining the box. "A rose, like the garden," she murmured. "And what of the library shelves? Any other secrets?" Craddock sighed. "We found a few books out of place. One with a torn page matching the scrap you found. The word debt was part of a paragraph about a financial scandal tied to Eleanor Pritchard's late husband. Miss Marple settled into her usual chair, her knitting a steady rhythm, as she observed the guests through the open door. Julian Fairchild, still reeling from the handkerchief's discovery, was pale, his spectacles fogged as he muttered to himself. Dr. Rupert Hayworth stood by the fireplace, his gold watch chain swinging as he argued with Sylvia Dale about the police's focus on Julian. "It's obvious he did it," Hayworth said, his voice sharp. Sylvia shook her head, her curls trembling. "You're too quick to judge, Doctor. Lavinia had plenty of enemies." Miss Marple noted the stain on Hayworth's cuff, now darker, and the way Sylvia's fingers clutched a locket at her throat, a gesture of anxiety. Leonard Voss hovered near Sylvia, his nervous tic more pronounced as he glanced at the police officers in the hall. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on his jacket, where the loose button still hung by a green thread, a match for the one in her basket. Eleanor Pritchard sat erect, her emeralds glinting as she fanned herself, her eyes cold when they met her nephew's. Colin Pritchard slouched in a chair, his grass-stained shoes tapping restlessly, one cufflink still missing. Clara Henshaw, knitting in her corner, was silent, but her needles moved with a ferocity that betrayed her tension. Miss Marple noted the frayed sleeve of her green cardigan, a tiny thorn still caught in the wool. Craddock's interviews resumed, and Miss Marple listened from her alcove, her needles clicking softly. Julian Fairchild was questioned again about the handkerchief. "I swear I lost it days before," he said, his voice cracking. "Someone must have taken it to frame me." Craddock pressed him about the memoir. "It ridiculed your work, didn't it?" Julian nodded, his hands trembling. "Yes, but I didn't kill her. I was in the billiard room." Miss Marple noted the smudge on his spectacles, wondering if the glass shard in her basket matched its lens. Dr. Hayworth was next, his tone brusque. "I've told you I was on the terrace. That memoir mentioned a malpractice case, but it wasn't about me." His fingers brushed his watch chain, and Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor, as if he feared the truth surfacing. Sylvia and Voss repeated their conservatory alibi, but Sylvia's voice faltered when asked about the locket she wore. "It's just a keepsake," she said, her eyes filling with tears. Voss's tic worsened, and Miss Marple recalled Betty's mention of papers in his pocket. Eleanor Pritchard was composed, but her fan snapped shut when Craddock mentioned her husband's debts. "Lavinia had no right to dredge up old scandals," she said coldly, "but I was in my room, as I told you." Colin's garden alibi was shakier, his temper flaring. "I didn't care about her book," he snapped. "I was outside, away from her." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his missing cufflink, the pea in her basket a silent accusation. Clara Henshaw was tight-lipped. "Lavinia betrayed us all," she said, "but I was reading, not murdering." Her green cardigan, now visibly frayed, drew Miss Marple's attention, the thorn a tiny clue to her presence in the garden. The staff were questioned again. Ernest Gibbs maintained his hallway post, his calm unshaken. Betty repeated her story of the thud, adding, "It was near the service stairs, I think." Mrs. Banks was curt, insisting she was in the kitchen. Miss Marple's mind lingered on Gibbs's composure, wondering if it was too perfect. After the interviews, Miss Marple walked through the house with Betty, pausing by the library door. She noted a faint scratch on the lock, barely visible, as if someone had tampered with it. "Betty," she asked, "did you ever see Mrs. Cresswell lock this door herself?" Betty shook her head. "No, miss, but Mr. Gibbs always checked it at night." Miss Marple nodded, adding the scratch to her mental list. "The cufflink," The green thread, the rose pollen, the thud, the scuff mark, the indentation, the glass shard, the paper scrap, the brass box. In the rose garden she examined the rope again, noting its frayed end and a faint smear of grease, matching the smudge on the service stairs banister. Nearby, she found a single pearl earring, half buried in the soil. "How careless," she murmured, tucking it into her basket. She recalled seeing Eleanor Pritchard wear similar earrings at dinner, one now conspicuously missing. Back in the morning room, she overheard a heated exchange between Sylvia and Voss. "You shouldn't have taken it, Lenny," Sylvia whispered fiercely. "If they find those papers, we're ruined." Voss's reply was a mumble, his tic frantic. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a village theft where stolen letters had revealed a hidden affair. Papers, she mused, are as dangerous as memoirs. Craddock joined her, holding the brass box. "We forced it open," he said. "Inside were letters, unsigned, but they mention a debt owed to Mrs. Cresswell, tied to a London scandal. Could point to Eleanor or Colin." Miss Marple nodded. "Or someone who knew of the debt, Inspector. Have you checked the library's lock? A scratch might suggest more than a key." Craddock's eyes widened. "You think someone picked it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I think, Inspector, that doors are only as secure as the hands that guard them." As the afternoon faded, the guests grew more fractious. Julian's handkerchief and the brass box fueling accusations. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The cufflink, the thread, the pollen, the thud, the scuff, the indentation, the glass, the paper, the box, the earring, the scratch. Lies, she thought, are like shadows. They shift, but they cannot hide the light forever. At Willow Hall, the tension simmered, and the dance of motives grew more desperate. But Miss Marple was ready to trace its next step. Chapter 8. The Emotional Breaking Point. The fifth day at Willow Hall dawned with a drizzle that mirrored the mood within St. Mary Mead. The murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had stretched the nerves of the manor's guests to breaking, their carefully crafted alibis cracking under the weight of Inspector Craddock's persistent questioning. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 10 a.m., her basket containing a small embroidered handkerchief, as a gesture of condolence, though her true aim was to catch the moment when emotion betrayed truth. She knew that in a murder case, the heart often spoke louder than the mind, and she was ready to listen. Betty, the parlour maid, met her at the door, her eyes swollen from sleeplessness. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's like a storm in there," she whispered, glancing towards the drawing-room. "Miss Dale's been crying all morning, and Mr. Voss won't leave her side. It's as if they're hiding something." Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "Tears can be as revealing as words, Betty. Have you noticed anything else about Mr. Voss's papers?" Betty hesitated, then said, "I saw him burning something in the fireplace last night. Looked like pages, miss, but I couldn't be sure." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Fire is a poor keeper of secrets, my dear." In the morning room, Inspector Craddock greeted her, his expression a mix of determination and weariness. "Miss Marple, we've made progress," he said, holding up a small key, its surface scratched. "Found this in the library lock. Must have been used to pick it. And the brass box's letters point to a debt tied to Eleanor Pritchard's husband, but they also mention a young actress and a literary rival. Could implicate Sylvia or Fairchild." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "A key in a lock is like a confession in a heart, Inspector. It opens more than one door. Have you examined the fireplace in the drawing-room?" Craddock frowned. Not yet, but I'll have it checked. You think Voss burned something? Miss Marple smiled faintly. I think, Inspector, that people destroy what they fear. And fear is a powerful motivator. She settled into her chair, her knitting a steady rhythm as she observed the guests through the open door. The drawing-room was a cauldron of tension, the guests' composure unravelling like a poorly knitted scarf. Julian Fairchild, still under suspicion for the blood-stained handkerchief, was pacing, his spectacles fogged with anxiety. I'm no murderer, he burst out when Dr. Rupert Haworth accused him again. You're all too quick to point fingers. Haworth, his gold watch chain swinging, retorted, Your handkerchief was in the garden, Fairchild. Explain that. Miss Marple noted the healing scratch on Julian's hand, and the ink-like stain on Haworth's cuff, now smudged as if scrubbed. Sylvia Dale was the centre of attention, her golden curls dishevelled as she sobbed into a handkerchief. Lavinia was cruel, she said, her voice breaking. She wrote about my past, things I've tried to forget. Leonard Voss, hovering nearby, tried to comfort her, but his nervous tic betrayed his agitation. We were in the conservatory, he insisted, his voice strained. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Sylvia's locket, which she clutched tightly, and Voss's jacket, where the loose button still hung by a green thread. Eleanor Pritchard sat apart, her emeralds dimmed by the grey light, her fan motionless. This circus is beneath us, she told Craddock coldly. I was in my room, as I've said. Lavinia's death is her own doing. Her nephew, Colin Pritchard, was less restrained, his sullen demeanour giving way to anger. She had it coming, he muttered, earning a sharp glare from Eleanor. Miss Marple noted Colin's missing cufflink, and the grass stains on his shoes, the heels worn in a way that suggested running. Clara Henshaw, knitting in her corner, was silent but tense, her needles flashing. Lavinia's memoir was a betrayal, she told Craddock when pressed. She wrote about my family's shame, debts, scandals, all of it. Miss Marple's eyes rested on Clara's green cardigan, the frayed sleeves still bearing that tiny thorn, and she recalled the green thread from the rose garden. The interviews took a dramatic turn when Sylvia, pushed by Craddock's questions about her locket, broke down. It's from my mother, she cried, her voice raw. Lavinia knew about her, about the scandal that ruined her. She was going to publish it. The room fell silent, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Voss, his tic frantic, tried to intervene. Sylvia, don't, he began, but she pushed him away. I can't keep lying, Lenny. She was going to destroy me. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting Sylvia's confession as a partial truth, a crack in the facade that hid something deeper. Craddock seized the moment, pressing Sylvia. Did you go to the library that night, Miss Dale? Sylvia shook her head, tears streaming. No, I was in the conservatory with Lenny, but I wanted her to stop. Voss's face paled, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand slipped into his pocket, as if checking for something, or ensuring it was gone. The staff were questioned again. Ernest Gibbs maintained his calm, insisting he'd seen no one in the hallway. Betty, trembling, repeated her story of the thud at 9:40, adding, I saw Mr. Voss near the fireplace last night, burning those papers. Mrs. Banks, the housekeeper, was curt. I was in the kitchen, as always. Mrs. Cresswell's demands kept me there. Miss Marple's mind lingered on Gibbs's composure, wondering if it concealed a secret as carefully as his starched cuffs. After the interviews, Miss Marple walked with Betty to the drawing-room fireplace, where ashes still smouldered. She poked gently at the embers, uncovering a charred fragment of paper with the word promise visible. How careless, she murmured. adding it to her basket beside the cufflink, green thread, glass shard, paper scrap, and pearl earring. She recalled a village scandal where burned letters had failed to hide a betrayal, the ashes revealing more than the writer intended. In the rose garden, she examined the rope again, noting its greasy texture and the indentation below the library window. A faint smear of grease on the window's sill matched the smudge on the service stairs banister. Someone moved quickly, she thought, picturing the layout of Willow Hall. The service stairs, the library window, the rose bed. She found another clue, a tiny metal clasp, like one from a spectacles case, half buried in the soil. It joined her growing collection. Back in the morning room, she overheard Colin muttering to Eleanor, "You pushed her too far, Aunt. You knew what she'd do." Eleanor's reply was icy. "Hold your tongue, Colin, or you'll regret it." Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts drifting to a village quarrel where family ties had masked a deeper resentment. "Loyalty," she mused, "can be a chain as heavy as debt." Craddock joined her, holding the charred paper fragment. "Voss was burning something, all right," he said. "This mentions a promise, maybe tied to Sylvia's past. And the key in the lock, it's not one of Mrs. Cresswell's. Someone brought it to pick the door." Miss Marple nodded. "A picked lock is a deliberate act, Inspector, and the ashes suggest someone feared exposure. Have you checked Mr. Voss's room for papers?" Craddock's eyes widened. "I'll get a warrant." As the drizzle turned to rain, the guests retreated to their rooms, Sylvia's outburst lingering like a storm cloud. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. The cufflink, the thread, the pollen, the thud, the scuff, the indentation, the glass, the paper, the box, the earring, the scratch, the clasp, the ashes. Emotion, she thought, is the key that unlocks lies, and someone has turned it. At Willow Hall, the tension boiled over, the dance of motives teetering on the edge of revelation. But Miss Marple was ready for its next step. Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The 6th day at Willow Hall brought a fragile calm to St. Mary Mead, the rain of the previous evening giving way to a pale, watery sun. The murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had woven a tight web of suspicion around the manor's guests, and the emotional cracks revealed by Sylvia Dale's outburst had deepened the tension. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 10:30 a.m., her basket now holding a small jar of honey, a neighbourly gift that masked her intent to tighten the net around the killer. She knew that a murderer, like a cornered animal, would reveal themselves under pressure, and she was ready to apply it with her quiet, unassuming precision. Betty, the parlour maid, greeted her with a nervous nod, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's like a funeral in there, Miss Marple," she whispered. "Miss Dale's been quiet since yesterday, and Mr. Voss looks like he hasn't slept. The police are searching his room now." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Truth has a way of keeping people awake, Betty. Have you seen anything else near the fireplace?" Betty shook her head. "Not since those ashes, miss. But I heard Mr. Gibbs muttering about keeping things tidy last night, near the library." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Tidy, you say? How very telling." In the morning room, Inspector Craddock met her, his expression a mix of determination and fatigue. "Miss Marple, we found something in Voss's room," he said, producing a crumpled sheet of paper, partially burned. "It's a letter, unsigned, mentioning a promise to keep a secret about Sylvia's mother. It matches the ashes you found, and the clasp you mentioned, it's from a spectacles case, Likely Fairchild's." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. "A promise is a heavy burden, Inspector, and a spectacles case suggests someone was careless with their disguise. Have you examined the library lock again?" Craddock frowned. "The scratch marks are deeper than we thought. Someone forced it, maybe with that key. But Gibbs insists he checked the lock before dinner, and it was fine." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "A butler's duty is to see everything, yet sometimes they see too little, or too much. Have you searched the service stairs for more traces?" Craddock's eyes widened. "Not thoroughly. I'll have it done." Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting a steady rhythm, as she observed the guests in the drawing-room. The air was thick with unease, the guests' interactions strained. Julian Fairchild, still shaken by the handkerchief and now the clasp, was defensive, his spectacles missing a lens. "I lost my case days ago," he told Craddock, his voice trembling. "Someone's setting me up." Dr. Rupert Haworth, his gold watch chain glinting, scoffed. "You're quick to protest, Fairchild. That memoir made you a laughingstock." Miss Marple noted the smudged stain on Haworth's cuff, now faintly red, and the way his eyes darted toward the library door. Sylvia Dale sat quietly, her golden curls pinned tightly, her locket clutched in her hand. Leonard Voss hovered nearby, his nervous tick relentless as he whispered to her, "We're fine, Sylvia. Just stay calm." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Voss's jacket, the loose button gone, leaving a frayed green thread. She recalled the thread from the rose garden, now possibly tied to Voss rather than Clara. Eleanor Pritchard, her emeralds dimmed by the pale light, was composed but tense, her fan motionless. "This is absurd," she told Craddock. "I was in my room, as I've said." Her nephew, Colin Pritchard, was agitated, his grass-stained shoes tapping. "Stop hounding us," he snapped. "Lavinia got what she deserved." Miss Marple noted his missing cufflink, and the way Eleanor's earring, one now missing, glinted on her left ear. Clara Henshaw, knitting in her corner, was silent but watchful, her green cardigan frayed at the sleeve. "Lavinia's book was poison," she muttered when pressed, "but I didn't touch her." Miss Marple's eyes rested on the thorn in Clara's cardigan, wondering if it was a red herring or a genuine clue. Craddock gathered the guests in the drawing-room, announcing a reconstruction of the murder evening to test their alibis. "We'll retrace your movements from 9:30 to 9:47 p.m., he said. "Miss Marple has kindly agreed to observe." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their composure cracking. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively, watched as Craddock positioned each suspect. Julian in the billiard-room, Haworth on the terrace, Sylvia and Voss in the conservatory, Eleanor in her room, Colin in the garden, Clara in the morning-room, Gibbs in the hallway, Betty in the pantry, and Mrs. Banks in the kitchen. As the reconstruction began, Miss Marple noted discrepancies. Julian's billiard shots were hesitant, as if unfamiliar with the table. Haworth's terrace cigarette took longer than claimed, his matchbook nearly empty. Sylvia and Voss lingered near the conservatory's garden door, Sylvia's shoes picking up fresh soil. Eleanor's room was too far to hear the scream clearly, yet she'd been among the first to arrive. Colin's garden path avoided the rosebed, yet his shoes bore rose petals. Clara's reading posture seemed staged, her book unopened. Gibbs's hallway post allowed a clear view of the library door, but his eyes flicked toward the service stairs. Betty's pantry was near the thud's source, and Mrs. Banks's kitchen duties seemed too convenient. During a break, Miss Marple slipped to the service stairs, finding another clue. A tiny metal pin, like one from a watch chain, lodged in a crack. It matched Hayworth's gold chain, which now hung unevenly. "How careless," she murmured, adding it to her basket beside the cufflink. Green thread, glass shard, paper scrap, pearl earring, charred paper, and clasp. She recalled a village scandal where a dropped pin had betrayed a thief's haste. Back in the drawing room, the reconstruction resumed and tensions boiled over. Sylvia, pressed about her locket, snapped, "It's none of your business." Voss tried to intervene, but his pocket bulged with papers. Drawing Craddock's eye, Colin, challenged about his shoes, shouted, "I wasn't in the rose garden." Eleanor's fan snapped shut, her single earring glinting. Julian, accused again about the handkerchief, stammered, "I'm being framed." Clara's needles faltered, her eyes darting to Gibbs, who remained impassive. Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his voice low. "They're cracking, but we need more. The rope, the lock, the box, all point to planning, but who?" Miss Marple nodded. "Pressure inspector. Reveals the fault lines. Have you searched the fireplace again? Ashes can hide more than one secret." Craddock sent Polk to check, who returned with another charred fragment, this one with the word betrayal visible. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind weaving the clues. The cufflink, the thread, the pollen, the thud, the scuff, the indentation, the glass, the paper, the box, the earring, the scratch, the clasp, the ashes, the pin. As evening fell, the guests dispersed, their nerves raw from the reconstruction. Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her thoughts circling the service stairs and the library window. A trap, she mused, is only as strong as the bait, and someone has taken it. At Willow Hall, the dance of motives teetered on the edge of collapse, and Miss Marple was ready to spring the trap. Chapter 10. The Truth Unraveled. The 7th day at Willow Hall broke with a deceptive serenity over St. Mary Mead, the pale sun casting long shadows across the manor's lawns. The murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had drawn the guests into a tightening noose of suspicion, their alibis crumbling under the weight of Inspector Craddock's investigation and Miss Jane Marple's quiet scrutiny. She arrived at 10 a.m., her basket holding a small posy of lavender, a gesture of calm that belied her purpose. To lay bare the truth in a final, dramatic reveal, Miss Marple knew that a murderer, like a poorly knitted stitch, could be unravelled with care, and she was ready to pull the thread that would expose the killer. Betty, the parlour maid, greeted her with wide eyes, her voice trembling. "It's like they're all waiting for something awful, Miss Marple," she whispered. "Mr. Voss has been pacing, and Miss Dale won't stop crying." Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes sharp. "Fear is a great revealer, Betty. Have you noticed anything more about Mr. Gibbs? His tidiness, perhaps?" Betty hesitated. "He was polishing the library door yesterday, miss, even though the police told him not to touch it." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "A tidy man is often hiding something, my dear." In the morning, Inspector Craddock met her, his face etched with determination. "Miss Marple, we've searched the fireplace again," he said, holding up a blackened metal clip, like one from a pen. "It was buried in the ashes, and it matches one missing from Voss's pen." The service stairs yielded a smear of polish, too. Gibbs's work, likely? Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly. Polish covers many sins, Inspector, and the clip suggests Mr. Voss was more involved than he claims. Have you opened the brass box's letters fully? Craddock produced a sheaf of papers. They detail a debt owed by Eleanor Pritchard's late husband, a promise to Sylvia's mother, and a literary feud with Julian Fairchild. But they're vague. Someone removed key pages. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. A half-told story is still a story, Inspector. The missing pages are as telling as the ones that remain. Craddock gathered the guests and staff in the drawing-room, announcing that Miss Marple would assist in a final reconstruction to resolve the case. "We'll walk through the night of the murder," he said, "and piece together the truth." The guests exchanged wary glances, their composure fraying. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting, watched as Craddock positioned each suspect. Julian Fairchild in the billiard-room, Dr. Rupert Hayworth on the terrace, Sylvia Dale and Leonard Voss in the conservatory, Eleanor Pritchard in her room, Colin Pritchard in the garden, Clara Henshaw in the morning-room, Ernest Gibbs in the hallway, Betty in the pantry, and Mrs. Banks in the kitchen. Miss Marple rose, her voice soft but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, a murder is a puzzle, and every piece matters. Let us begin with the facts." She held up the cufflink with a P. This was found in the rose garden, suggesting Mr. or Mrs. Pritchard was there. But Colin's cufflink is missing, and his shoes bear rose petals. Colin flushed, muttering, "I told you I was walking." Miss Marple continued, holding the green thread. "This matches Mr. Voss's jacket, not Miss Henshaw's cardigan, though both were in the garden. Mr. Voss, you burned papers in the fireplace, papers about a promise." Voss's tic surged, his voice stammering. I was protecting Sylvia." Sylvia gasped, clutching her locket. Miss Marple's eyes turned to her. "Your locket holds a secret, Miss Dale, tied to your mother's scandal in Mrs. Cresswell's memoir. You were in the conservatory, but your shoes bear garden soil." Sylvia's tears flowed, but she said nothing. Miss Marple held up the glass shard. "This matches Mr. Fairchild's spectacles case, yet his protests of a frame are not without merit. The handkerchief was too convenient." Julian exhaled, his shoulders sagging. She then showed the pearl earring. "Mrs. Pritchard, you lost this in the garden, near the rope that reached the library window." Eleanor's fan snapped shut, her face pale. "I dropped it earlier," she said coldly. Turning to the staff, Miss Marple's voice grew firmer. "Mr. Gibbs, your tidiness is admirable, but polishing the library door hid a scratch on the lock, a lock you claimed was secure." Gibbs's calm faltered, his hands twitching. "I was doing my duty," he said. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, but your duty included more. The brass box, hidden behind the shelf, held letters you knew about, didn't it? Letters that mentioned a debt you shared with Mrs. Cresswell." The room gasped, and Craddock stepped forward. "Miss Marple, are you saying Gibbs is the killer?" She shook her head. "Not alone, Inspector. The murder required two, one to act, one to plan. The thud Betty heard at 9:40 was the box, dropped by Mr. Voss as he climbed through the library window, using the rope. The grease on the stairs and sill came from his pen, which lost its clip. But the letter opener, wiped clean, was used by someone who knew the house's secrets. She turned to Eleanor Pritchard. "Mrs. Pritchard, you planned it. Your husband's debt to Mrs. Cresswell, detailed in her memoir, threatened ruin. You enlisted Mr. Voss, whose promise to Sylvia's mother bound him to you. You were in your room, but you slipped down the service stairs, leaving a scuff mark and grease. You picked the lock, entered the library, and stabbed Mrs. Cresswell as she read her manuscript. Voss climbed through the window to retrieve the letters, dropping the box in his haste. Eleanor's face was ashen, her emeralds dull. "You have no proof," she whispered. Miss Marple held up the metal pin. "This, from Dr. Hayworth's watch chain, was on the stairs. Dropped when you borrowed it to pick the lock, Mrs. Pritchard. Dr. Hayworth, you suspected but said nothing, fearing your own scandal." Hayworth's jaw tightened, his stain-smudged cuff trembling. Voss broke, his tic uncontrollable. "I didn't want to, but she made me. The letters would have ruined Sylvia." Sylvia sobbed, her locket falling open to reveal a tiny photo. Eleanor rose, her voice icy. "You're a meddling old woman, Miss Marple." But Craddock signalled his men, who moved to detain her and Voss. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting resumed. "The truth," she said softly, "is like a garden. It grows best when tended carefully." The guests were silent, their secrets laid bare. Craddock shook his head, marvelling. "You've done it again, Miss Marple." As the police led Eleanor and Voss away, Miss Marple gathered her clues. The cufflink, thread, pollen, glass, paper, box, earring, scratch, clasp, ashes, pin, and tucked them into her basket. Motives, she thought, are the roots of murder, and they always show. At Willow Hall, the dance of motives ended, and Miss Marple prepared to return to her quiet cottage, her work done. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after the dramatic revelation at Willow Hall, St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale, as if the village itself had been holding its breath. The arrest of Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard and Mr. Leonard Voss for the murder of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell had sent ripples through the community, and the manor stood quiet, its grandeur dimmed by the shadow of the crime. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her cottage by the window, her knitting idle in her lap, gazed out at the familiar hedgerows, her mind turning over the events of the past week. She knew that a murder, once solved, left behind not just justice, but lessons, and she was ready to reflect on the dance of motives that had led to such a tragic end. The village was abuzz with talk, as Cherry Baker, Miss Marple's maid, recounted breathlessly over breakfast. "They're saying Mrs. Pritchard was cold as ice when they took her away, Miss Marple," Cherry said, her eyes wide. "And poor Miss Dale, crying her heart out for Mr. Voss. Who'd have thought it?" Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes thoughtful. "People are often surprising, Cherry, but rarely unpredictable. Their motives, like seeds, grow in plain sight if you know where to look." She decided to visit Willow Hall one last time, ostensibly to return a borrowed teacup, but truly to ensure the remaining guests were settling after the ordeal. She arrived at 11 a.m., her basket containing a small packet of lavender seeds for Betty, who had been so helpful. The parlour-maid greeted her with a shy smile, her nerves calmed by the resolution. "It's quieter now, miss," Betty said, leading her to the morning room. "But it's still strange, knowing what happened." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Time heals, my dear, and so does truth." Inspector Craddock was there, finalising his report, his expression one of quiet admiration. "Miss Marple, you've outdone yourself," he said, setting aside his notebook. "Eleanor Pritchard confessed last night. She planned it all, using Voss's loyalty to Sylvia to manipulate him. The letters in the brass box were her motive. They detailed her husband's debt to Mrs. Cresswell, which would have ruined her socially if exposed. Voss climbed through the window to retrieve them, but Eleanor did the killing. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. A debt is a heavy chain, Inspector, and pride is a sharp spur. Craddock leaned forward, curious. How did you piece it together, Miss Marple? The clues were so small. She smiled faintly, her eyes twinkling. Small things, Inspector, are the stitches of life. A cufflink, a thread, a shard of glass. They tell a story if you listen. I noticed the rose pollen on Miss Dale's dress, the grease on the stairs, the scratch on the lock. They pointed to movement, to haste, to a plan. And people's faces, oh, they betray so much. Mrs. Pritchard's coldness, Mr. Voss's tick, Miss Dale's tears. They were like lines in a play, revealing the plot. She paused, her needles still. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen many such plays. A girl who stole to pay a debt, a man who lied to protect a secret. They all follow the same steps. Mrs. Pritchard thought her wealth and status would shield her, but she forgot that secrets, like flowers, cannot stay buried forever. Mr. Voss, poor man, was bound by a promise to Miss Dale's mother, a promise Mrs. Pritchard exploited. It was a dance of motives, and they stumbled. Craddock shook his head, marvelling. You see people so clearly, Miss Marple. What made you suspect Gibbs wasn't the killer? She tilted her head. His tidiness, Inspector. It was too perfect, like a stage set. He polished the lock to cover the scratch, but not to hide his own guilt, only to protect the house's order. He knew something, perhaps, but he was not the hand that struck. That was Mrs. Pritchard, with Mr. Voss as her unwitting partner. The remaining guests were subdued, gathered in the drawing-room for a final farewell before departing Willow Hall. Julian Fairchild, cleared of suspicion, was packing his notebooks, his spectacles repaired, but his confidence shaken. I owe you my thanks, Miss Marple, he said quietly. That handkerchief nearly ruined me. She nodded kindly. It was a clumsy frame, Mr. Fairchild. A true writer would have been more subtle. Dr. Rupert Hayworth, his watch chain now even, approached her with a gruff nod. I should have spoken up about Eleanor's schemes, he admitted, but I feared my own past would come out. Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. Silence is a choice, Doctor, but it rarely serves the truth. Sylvia Dale, her golden curls limp, was pale but composed, her locket tucked away. I didn't know what Lenny would do, she said softly. I only wanted to stop Lavinia's book. Miss Marple patted her hand. Your heart was loyal, Miss Dale, but loyalty can blind us. Clara Henshaw, her green cardigan folded neatly, was preparing to return to her village cottage. Lavinia was my cousin, but she was cruel, she said, her voice bitter but resigned. I'm glad it's over. Miss Marple nodded. Family ties are strong, Miss Henshaw, but they can strangle as well as bind. Colin Pritchard, his sullen demeanour softened, lingered by the door. Aunt Eleanor always controlled everything, he said. I should have stood up to her. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. You're young, Mr. Pritchard. There's time to learn courage. The staff, too, were settling. Ernest Gibbs, his calm restored, bowed slightly to Miss Marple. You saw through us all, madam, he said. Betty, clutching the lavender seeds, smiled shyly. I'll plant these, miss, for a fresh start. Mrs. Banks in the kitchen offered a rare nod of respect. You've done the house a service, Miss Marple. As noon approached, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her basket lighter but her heart steady. Craddock walked her to the Shunjun gate, his notebook closed. "What's your secret, Miss Marple? How do you see what we miss?" She smiled, her knitting tucked away. "I watch, Inspector, and I listen. People are like my garden. They reveal themselves in their habits, their fears, their loves. In St. Mary Mead, I've learned that no one is ever quite what they seem, but they are always what they do." She paused, gazing at the manor's ivy-clad walls. Mrs. Cresswell's memoir was a mirror, and mirrors show the truth, even when it's ugly. Mrs. Pritchard and Mr. Voss could not bear their reflections, so they shattered the glass. But truth, like lavender, grows back. Craddock chuckled. "You make it sound so simple." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "It is, Inspector, when you know the pattern." She returned to her cottage, the village settling into its familiar rhythm. The church bells rang, the hedgerows bloomed, and Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resumed. The dance of motives at Willow Hall had ended, but she knew others would follow. For human nature, like her wool, was full of knots waiting to be unravelled. With a quiet smile, she turned down her lamp, ready for whatever St. Mary Mead might bring next. Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The 8th day in St. Mary Mead dawned with a gentle mist, softening the outlines of the village and lending an air of quiet resolution to the aftermath of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell's murder. Willow Hall, once a stage for secrets and deceit, stood almost empty now, its remaining occupants preparing to depart as the shadow of the crime began to lift. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her cottage with a cup of tea, reflected on the intricate tapestry of motives that had unravelled the day before. She knew that even after a case was solved, its echoes lingered, revealing truths about those left behind. Determined to tie up the final threads, she set out for Willow Hall at 10:30 a.m., her basket carrying a small pot of homemade marmalade as a parting gift. The manor's gravel drive was quiet, the police presence reduced to a single constable stationed at the gate. Betty, the parlour maid, greeted Miss Marple with a brighter smile than before, though her eyes still held a trace of unease. "It's like the house can breathe again, Miss Marple," she said, leading her to the morning room. "But Miss Dale's leaving today, and she's still so upset about Mr. Voss." Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes gentle but keen. "Grief, my dear, is a heavy burden, but it often reveals what lies beneath. Have you seen Miss Dale this morning?" Betty hesitated, then whispered, "She was in the rose garden, miss, just before you came. She was holding that locket and crying something awful." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "A garden is a place for reflection, Betty, and reflection can be most revealing." In the morning room, Inspector Craddock was packing his files, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Miss Marple, we've wrapped up most of the loose ends," he said, offering her a chair. "Mrs. Pritchard's confession was detailed. She admitted to orchestrating the murder, using Voss's loyalty to Sylvia to ensure his cooperation. The letters in the brass box were her undoing. They proved her husband's debt to Mrs. Cresswell was tied to a fraudulent investment scheme. Voss retrieved them to protect Sylvia's mother's name, but Eleanor struck the fatal blow." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "A partnership of convenience, Inspector, but convenience rarely outlasts fear. Have you learned more about Miss Dale's role?" Craddock frowned. She claims ignorance, but her tears suggest she knew more than she let on. The locket, she admitted it, holds a photo of her mother who was ruined by a scandal Mrs. Cresswell threatened to expose. Sylvia swears she was in the conservatory, but we found a second earring in her room, matching the one you found in the garden. Miss Marple nodded. A matching pair tells its own story, Inspector. Perhaps Miss Dale was closer to the truth than she wished. Miss Marple settled by the window, her knitting a steady rhythm, as she observed the remaining guests in the drawing-room. Julian Fairchild, now cleared, was gathering his manuscripts, his relief tempered by lingering embarrassment. "I'll never trust a house party again," he told Dr. Rupert Haworth, who was adjusting his watch chain, its missing pin replaced. Haworth's gruff reply was, "Nor I, Fairchild. But we've learned to keep our secrets closer." Miss Marple noted the faint stain on Haworth's cuff, now faded, and the way his eyes avoided hers. Sylvia Dale sat alone, her golden curls loose, her locket clutched tightly. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes red-rimmed. "I didn't know what Lenny would do," she said softly. "I only wanted to stop Lavinia's book." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Intentions, my dear, are like roses. They bloom beautifully but can hide thorns. Your locket tells a story of loyalty, but perhaps also of knowledge." Sylvia's tears fell, but she said nothing more. Clara Henshaw, packing her knitting, was subdued, her green cardigan neatly folded. "I'm glad it's over," she told Miss Marple. "Lavinia's memoir would have ruined us all." Miss Marple nodded, noting the absence of the thorn in Clara's sleeve, perhaps removed in haste. Colin Pritchard, preparing to leave with his aunt's belongings, was quieter, his sullenness replaced by a weary acceptance. "I should have stopped her," he said, his voice low. "Aunt Eleanor always got her way." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Family, Mr. Pritchard, is a tie that binds tightly, but it can also teach us to stand alone." The staff, too, were moving on. Ernest Gibbs, his composure intact, bowed slightly to Miss Marple. "You've brought order to chaos, madam," he said, Betty clutching her. Lavender Seeds smiled shyly. "I'll plant these soon, miss, for a new beginning." Mrs. Banks in the kitchen offered a rare word of thanks. "You've cleared the air, Miss Marple. The house feels lighter." Miss Marple took a final walk through the rose garden, pausing by the bed where she'd found the pearl earring. The indentation was gone, smoothed by the gardener, but the rope's frayed end remained, tied to a tree. She recalled a village scandal where a hidden letter had revealed a family's shame, much like the letters in the brass box. Truth, she thought, is like a garden. It grows back, no matter how deeply you bury it. Back in the morning room, Craddock joined her, his report complete. "We found the second earring in Sylvia's jewellery box," he said. "She admits to being in the garden earlier that day, but not at the time of the murder. Do you think she was involved?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Not in the act, Inspector, but in the silence. She knew of Voss's plan, perhaps, and chose to protect him. Love makes us blind but not blameless." As noon approached, the guests departed, their cars crunching down the gravel drive. Julian Fairchild left for London, his manuscripts under his arm. Dr. Haworth drove off, his watch chain glinting. Sylvia Dale, her locket hidden, boarded a train with a quiet farewell. Clara Henshaw returned to her cottage, her knitting bag heavy. Colin Pritchard left alone, his aunt's emeralds packed away. The staff resumed their duties, Willow Hall settling into a quieter rhythm. Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, her basket lighter but her mind full. She sat by her window, her knitting resumed, and reflected on the case. Motives, she mused, are like the seasons. They change, but they always return. Mrs. Pritchard's pride, Mr. Voss's loyalty, Miss Dale's fear, they danced together, and the music was murder. She thought of the clues, the cufflink, the thread, the pollen, the glass, the paper, the box, the earring, the scratch, the clasp, the ashes, the pin, and how they'd woven a pattern only patience could reveal. The church bells rang, the hedgerows bloomed, and St. Mary Mead carried on. Miss Marple turned down her lamp, her thoughts settling like dust after a storm. The echoes of truth had sounded, and she was content to let them fade, knowing the village would always have another story to tell. Chapter 13. The Lingering Shadows. The 9th day in St. Mary Mead brought a crisp clarity to the air, as if the village sought to shake off the lingering shadows of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell's murder. Willow Hall, now nearly empty, stood as a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded within its walls, its grandeur tempered by the weight of recent events. Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her cottage with her morning tea, gazed out at the familiar rooftops, her mind sifting through the aftermath of the case. She knew that even a solved murder left ripples, stirring hidden truths and unresolved tensions, and she felt compelled to ensure no loose threads remained. At 10:15 a.m., she set out for Willow Hall, her basket carrying a small bundle of crocheted doilies as a final gesture of neighbourly goodwill. The Manor's drive was quiet, the police presence gone, leaving only the faint hum of village life. Betty, the parlour-maid, greeted Miss Marple with a tentative smile, her apron freshly pressed. "It's almost normal again, Miss Marple," she said, leading her to the morning room. "But Miss Henshaw's been so quiet, and young Mr. Pritchard stopped by yesterday, looking lost." Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes sharp. "Loss leaves a mark, Betty, but so does guilt. Have you seen Miss Henshaw today?" Betty lowered her voice. "She was in the library this morning, miss, looking at Mrs. Cresswell's books. She seemed sad, but angry too." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Anger and sadness are old companions, my dear. They often walk hand in hand." In the morning room, she found Clara Henshaw alone, her green cardigan folded neatly on a chair, her knitting idle. Clara looked up, her pinched face softening slightly. "Jane, you've come again," she said, her voice weary. "I suppose you're here to tidy up the last of this mess." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. "Not to tidy, Clara, but to understand. Lavinia's death touched you deeply, didn't it?" Clara's eyes hardened. "She was my cousin, but she betrayed me. Her memoir would have dragged our family's name through the mud. Debts, scandals, all of it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Family is a powerful bond, Clara, but it can also be a burden. Did you ever speak to her about the memoir before she died?" Clara's fingers tightened on her chair. "I tried that afternoon. She laughed, said it was her right to tell the truth. I left her in the library, alive and smug." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And yet, Clara, your cardigan bore a thorn from the rose garden, where the rope was found. Were you there that evening?" Clara's face paled, but she shook her head. "I was in the morning room, reading. The thorn? I must have brushed against the roses earlier." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the hesitation in Clara's voice, so like a village woman who'd once lied to protect her loved one. The remaining occupants of Willow Hall were few. Julian Fairchild had left for London, his manuscripts packed, his reputation bruised but intact. Dr. Rupert Hayworth had returned to Harley Street, his secrets buried with a promise of silence. Sylvia Dale had departed for a new role, her locket a private reminder of her loss. Colin Pritchard, however, had returned briefly, and Miss Marple found him in the drawing-room, staring at a portrait of Mrs. Cresswell. "She ruined everything," he said, his voice low. "Aunt Eleanor thought she could control it, but it all fell apart." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Control is an illusion, Mr. Pritchard. Your aunt's pride led her to murder. But what led you to the garden that night? Your shoes, so worn at the heels, suggest more than a walk." Colin flushed, his hands clenching. "I was angry, that's all. I didn't go near the library." Miss Marple nodded, noting the faint tremor in his voice, reminiscent of a village boy caught in a lie. She took a final walk through the house, pausing by the library door, now unlocked and unguarded. The room was as it had been, save for the absence of the brass box and the blood-stained manuscript. Miss Marple examined the lock, the scratch marks still visible, and recalled Gibbs's polishing. A tidy man, she thought, but tidiness cannot erase truth. In the rose garden, she stood by the bed where she'd found the pearl earring and the rope's indentation, now smoothed by time. A single rose petal, caught in the grass, reminded her of Sylvia's pollen-stained dress. "Everyone leaves a trace," she mused, "even when they think they've covered it." Back in the morning room, she spoke with Ernest Gibbs, the butler, who was preparing the house for its next chapter. "You've restored order, Miss Marple," he said, his calm intact. "I only wish I'd seen more that night." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You saw enough, Mr. Gibbs, to keep the house running smoothly. But tell me, did you ever notice Mrs. Pritchard near the service stairs before the scream?" Gibbs hesitated, then nodded. "Once, earlier that day. She was checking the linens, she said." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Linens indeed, a convenient excuse." Betty joined them, her lavender seeds tucked in her apron. "I'm planting these tomorrow, miss," she said, "for a fresh start." Miss Marple patted her hand. "A garden is a fine teacher, Betty. It shows us that growth follows even the darkest days." Mrs. Banks, passing by, offered a gruff nod. "You've done us a service, Miss Marple. The house feels clean again." As noon approached, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her basket lighter but her mind full. She reflected on the case, the clues weaving a pattern that had led to justice. The cufflink, the green thread, the rose pollen, the glass shard, the paper scrap, the brass box, the pearl earring, the lock's scratch, the spectacles clasp, the charred ashes, the watch chain pin. Motives, she thought, are like shadows. They follow us, but they cannot hide from the light. She paused at the gate, gazing at Willow Hall's ivy-clad walls. Mrs. Cresswell's memoir was a spark, she mused, and pride, loyalty, and fear fanned it into a flame. Mrs. Pritchard and Mr. Voss danced to its tune, but the music was their own making. The village carried on, its rhythm restored, and Miss Marple walked home, her knitting tucked away, ready for the next story St. Mary, Mead might tell. Chapter 14. The Final Threads. The 10th day in St. Mary Mead brought a soft golden light to the village, as if the sun itself sought to mend the wounds left by the tragedy at Willow Hall. The manor, now almost deserted, stood like a grand old dame, recovering her dignity after a scandal. Miss Jane Marple, sipping her tea by her cottage window, felt the quiet satisfaction of a case resolved. Yet she knew that even the tightest knots left stray threads. Determined to ensure no lingering questions remained, she set out for Willow Hall at 10:45 a.m., her basket carrying a small vial of rosewater as a final gesture of goodwill. Her purpose was to tie up the last echoes of the murder, to ensure the village could fully return to its peaceful rhythm. The manor's drive was silent, the gravel undisturbed save for a gardener raking leaves. Betty, the parlour maid, greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile, her nerves eased by the passage of days. "It's almost like before, Miss Marple," she said, leading her to the morning room. "Miss Henshaw's leaving today, and the house feels lighter." Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes keen. "A house, like a heart, heals with time, Betty. Have you seen Miss Henshaw with her knitting lately?" Betty hesitated, then said, "She was packing it this morning, miss, but she dropped a needle in the library." "Looked upset about it." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "A dropped needle can prick more than fingers, my dear." In the morning room, Clara Henshaw was preparing to depart, her green cardigan folded in her suitcase, her face weary but composed. "Jane," she said, looking up, "you've brought peace to this house, but I'll be glad to leave it." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. "Leaving is sometimes the best healing, Clara. But tell me, did you ever find those pages from Lavinia's memoir you feared?" Clara's eyes flickered, her hands stilling. "No, and I'm glad they're gone. She had no right to expose our family's pain. Debts, losses, all of it." Miss Marple nodded, noting the faint tremor in Clara's voice, so like a village woman who'd once hidden a letter to save face. The manor was nearly empty now. Julian Fairchild was long gone, his reputation salvaged, but his pride dented. Dr. Rupert Hayworth had resumed his practice, his secrets buried. Sylvia Dale was performing in a new play, her locket a private talisman. Colin Pritchard had left for London, seeking a fresh start away from his aunt's shadow. The staff, too, were settling into routine. Ernest Gibbs, the butler, was overseeing the house's closure, his calm unshaken. Mrs. Banks in the kitchen was preparing for new owners, her brusqueness softened by relief. Miss Marple found Gibbs in the hall, polishing a silver candlestick. "You've kept this house in order, Mr. Gibbs," she said. "But tell me, did you ever suspect Mrs. Pritchard before, that night?" Gibbs paused, his cloth still. "I saw her near the service stairs once, madam, but I thought it was her business. A butler doesn't pry." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yet you noticed, Mr. Gibbs. That is enough." She took a final walk through the rose garden, pausing by the bed where the rope and pearl earring had been found. The ground was smooth now, the indentation gone, but a single rose, bruised but blooming, caught her eye. She recalled the pollen on Sylvia's dress, the green thread from Voss's jacket, and the thorn in Clara's cardigan. Every garden tells a story, she thought, and every story leaves a mark. In the library, she examined the shelves where the brass box had been hidden. A faint outline of dust remained, marking its place, and she found a single knitting needle, dropped as Betty had said. Its tip was slightly bent, as if used to pry something open. "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, tucking it into her basket beside the cufflink. "Green thread, glass shard, paper scrap, pearl earring, spectacles clasp, charred ashes, and watch chain pin. She recalled a village incident where a bent hairpin had unlocked a secret drawer, revealing a hidden truth. Back in the morning room, Betty joined her, her lavender seeds sprouting in a pot by the window. "They're growing already, miss," she said, her smile bright. "Thanks to you." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've grown too, Betty, in courage and observation. Keep watching, my dear." Mrs. Banks appeared, offering a rare cup of tea. "You've cleared the air, Miss Marple," she said gruffly. "The house can start anew." Miss Marple smiled. "A house, like a village, thrives on truth, Mrs. Banks." As noon approached, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her basket heavier with the bent needle, but her heart light. She reflected on the case, the clues weaving a pattern that had led to justice. The cufflink, the thread, the pollen, the glass, the paper, the box, the earring, the scratch, the clasp, the ashes, the pin, the needle. Motives, she mused, are like roses. They bloom in beauty, but prick when mishandled. Mrs. Pritchard's pride, Mr. Voss's loyalty, Miss Dale's fear. They wove a deadly dance, but the steps were always clear. She paused at the gate, gazing at Willow Hall's ivy-clad walls. Mrs. Cresswell's memoir was a mirror, she thought, reflecting truths too painful to face. Mrs. Pritchard and Mr. Voss broke it, but the shards still spoke. The village hummed with life, the church bells ringing, the hedgerows blooming. Miss Marple walked home, her knitting tucked away, her mind at peace. The final threads were tied, and St. Mary Mead was ready for its next chapter, whatever it might bring. Chapter 15. The Quiet Departure. The 11th day in St. Mary Mead dawned with a serene clarity. The village bathed in a soft autumn glow that seemed to promise renewal after the tumult of Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell's murder. Willow Hall, now empty of its guests and nearly restored to its former calm, stood as a testament to the resilience of order over chaos. Miss Jane Marple, sitting by her cottage window with her morning tea, watched the sparrows flit among the hedgerows, her mind resting on the intricate dance of motives that had been laid bare. She knew that every case, once resolved, left the village slightly changed, and she felt a quiet duty to ensure its peace was fully restored. At 10 a.m., she set out for Willow Hall one final time, her basket carrying a small packet of chamomile seeds. A symbol of calm for the manor's new chapter, the gravel drive was silent. The gardeners raked the only sound as leaves were swept into neat piles. Betty, the parlour-maid, greeted Miss Marple with a warm, relieved smile, her apron crisp and her spirits lifted. "The house feels alive again, Miss Marple," she said, leading her to the morning room. "Miss Henshaw left yesterday, and Mr. Gibbs says new owners are coming soon. It's like the storm's past." Miss Marple nodded, her pale eyes gentle but sharp. "Storms clear the air, Betty, but they leave roots to tend. Have you seen Mr. Gibbs this morning?" Betty's smile faltered slightly. "He was in the library, miss, packing away Mrs. Cresswell's books. He looked thoughtful, like he was saying goodbye." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. "Goodbyes are often a time for reflection, my dear." In the morning room, the air was lighter, the heavy tension of the past week gone. The furniture gleamed, polished by Mrs. Banks's diligent hand, and Betty's lavender sprouts thrived in their pot by the window. Miss Marple settled into her usual chair, her knitting a soft rhythm as she reflected on the case's final echoes. The clues, the cufflink, green thread, rose pollen, glass shard, paper scrap, brass box, pearl earring, lock scratch, spectacles clasp, charred ashes, watch chain pin, and bent needle had woven a tapestry of truth, revealing Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard's pride and Mr. Leonard Voss's loyalty as the threads of murder. Ernest Gibbs entered, his butler's calm intact but softened by a trace of weariness. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "you've done this house a great service. It's ready for a new beginning." Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "Order is a butler's gift, Mr. Gibbs, but truth is everyone's duty. You saw more than you said, didn't you, about Mrs. Pritchard's movements that day?" Gibbs's eyes flickered, but he nodded. "I saw her near the service stairs before dinner, madam, with a key in her hand. I thought it was for the linen cupboard, but I should have questioned it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You kept the house running, Mr. Gibbs. That was your role, and you played it well." Mrs. Banks appeared, offering a rare smile. "The kitchen's back to normal, Miss Marple," she said. "Your chamomile will do nicely in the garden." Miss Marple handed her the seeds. "Plant them with care, Mrs. Banks. They'll bring peace to the soil, as you've brought it to the house." Betty lingered, her lavender pot in hand. "I've learned so much, miss," she said shyly. "Watching you, I mean. You see things others miss." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've a sharp eye yourself, Betty. Keep it keen, and you'll see the world clearly." Miss Marple took a final walk through the rose garden, pausing by the bed where the rope and pearl earring had been found. The roses were fading now, their petals falling like memories of the crime. She recalled the village scandals of her youth. A stolen letter, a hidden debt, a whispered betrayal, and how they mirrored the motives at Willow Hall. Human nature, she thought, is like these roses, beautiful, thorny, and ever-recurring. In the library, she found the shelves neat, Mrs. Cresswell's books boxed for storage. The dust outline of the brass box was gone, but the bent needle, left behind by Clara, remained in her basket, a reminder of how close the truth had come to being missed. "Every clue," she mused, "is a whisper of the heart. Mrs. Pritchard's pride whispered of ruin, Mr. Voss's loyalty of sacrifice, Miss Dale's fear of exposure. They danced, and the music was deadly." As noon approached, Miss Marple prepared to leave, her basket light but her heart full. She paused at the manor's gate, gazing at its ivy-clad walls. Willow Hall, she thought, is like Saint. Mary Mead, a place of secrets, but also of truths waiting to bloom. The village hummed with life, the church bells ringing, the hedgerows vibrant. The case had left its mark, but the village would heal, as it always did. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting resumed. She reflected on the dance of motives, Eleanor's cold ambition, Voss's desperate loyalty, Sylvia's silent complicity, Clara's hidden anger, Colin's sullen resentment, Hayworth's guarded secrets, Fairchild's wounded pride. Motives, she mused, are the roots of every crime, and in St. Mary Mead I know the soil they grow in. She turned down her lamp, her thoughts settling like petals on the grass, content that the truth had prevailed, and that the village was ready for its next story.